Torej, današnja okrogla miza, kot je že bilo povedano, je prva v seriji dogodkov o obeležitvi 20. obletnice članstva Slovenije v NATO. Allow me to switch to the language of the panel discussion. Welcome to the second part of today's event, to the panel discussion on NATO, in 75 years of NATO, the role and significance in the past, present, and future. My name is Anka Menzin, and I will be moderating this roundtable together with our distinguished panelists. So with us today we have His Excellency Andrei Taran, the Ukrainian Ambassador to Slovenia, Her Excellency Tiffany Sadler, British Ambassador to Slovenia, Dr. Daniel Čeličec, State Secretary in the Ministry of Defense of Slovenia, and Dr. John Marshall Callahan, a Professor of International Relations. Thank you for joining us today. So in the speeches, we've heard a lot about the endurance of NATO. And yes, it was established in a post-World War II situation where countries, more than anything, needed peace and stability. Similar security arrangements came and went. However, the transatlantic collective security arrangement not only persevered, but it grew into a cornerstone of the European security system. Initially a purely military alliance, it is now a very strong political force as well. It has seen many enlargements, became operational, and is now again facing challenges to which it will have to adapt in order to survive. But before we go exploring the challenges and the future of NATO, I would like to take a step back and to the early days. And Dr. Callahan, the United States have been one of the main driving forces behind NATO since the very beginning. Why is it so important for the United States to form an alliance of collective defense with European nations?
Thank you, and I have to say that I do not represent the U.S. government. However, I'm very thankful, Madam Ambassador, and your team for the invitation for me to come and be part of these celebrations. It's really quite amazing to be here. So thank you to all of you for my opportunity to be here. So it's the history, right? And I think that in this case, the history actually begins in 1919 and 1920, when the United States, and not to throw shade, but also the UK to somewhat, essentially, mainly the US, but pulled out of Europe after the First World War. And however it played out, at the end of the day, the French were left alone to basically hold Europe with rising revanchist powers. And after the Second World War, that really couldn't happen again. Now, there's a unique piece of American history that's part of this, and it's something that we don't really see now. You go outside and you see the pictures of American military equipment and aircraft carriers and operating in different parts of the world. But up until the Second World War, the US didn't really do that. And the mass mobilized army, we usually only did that during the war, and as soon as the war ended, we stopped. If you look at the American Civil War and World War I, when the war ended, the military ended. And the United States was not a sort of military culture. The army was something you created again when you needed to, and the standing forces were quite small. And we actually tried to do that again in 1945. It was bring the troops home, end the spending, get back to rebuilding the economy from the Depression. And these are the things that were happening between 1945 and 1948. But then you get to 1948 and events such as the Berlin airlift, which demonstrated that the Soviets were quite serious about isolating Berlin, changing the post-war agreements and the post-war status quo, and being quite aggressive. And there were actions in Poland and Greece and elsewhere in Europe that showed that the Soviets weren't finished. And then you get to the pivotal year of 1949. Now, these events did not all happen before signing, because I can go without too. These events did not come, all of them, before the signing of NATO. But in that year of 1949, the Russians got the bomb, China was finishing the process of becoming communist, and the world was very much solidifying into two blocks, and quite aggressively from the Soviet bloc. And so now the United States, it seeks to balance and sort of contain the Soviet Union without, believe it or not, without spending billions of dollars and without rebuilding giant armed forces. So how do you do it? You get the allies together, and you get the people who are under the most direct threat in Europe together, and you work together to create that defensive alliance. Now, and not speaking for the Europeans, it's not my place to do so. Should I? No worries. So, no, it's all good. Is it for the recording? Because I okay. So, from the European perspective, as much as I can say it, there was also a great desire to avoid the mistake of 1919 and keep the Americans in Europe. Because the great mistake of the 20s and 30s is that the Americans went home. And to a great extent, the other great power, the UK, also sort of went home. And that could not happen again, given the severity of the Soviet threat. So what do we say NATO, back then, what did they say NATO was for? It was to keep the Americans in, keep the Soviets out, and keep the Germans down. And if you remember the history, you can remember why all those things were very valid. So that's the beginning of the alliance. It's the U.S. sort of, I don't want to say waking up, we understood the threat, but becoming very aware that there had to be a military response to the Soviet threat, looking for allies with which to do it, understanding that the battleground would be in Germany on that inter-German border, and therefore the Germans had to be part of it, which took some convincing to convince everybody else in Europe that the Germans actually needed to be rearmed and to be a part of it, and to essentially create the system for containment and for defense. That's in my mind, the foundational sort of principles of NATO. And I think that they stand today. Last comment, I think that the Euro-Atlantic alliance and Euro-Atlantic economic relationship is sort of the foundational relationship in international relations. And NATO's validity continues. In defense, obviously, we see what's going on in the East, but the requirement to keep the US and Europe is still, I think, very valid, both economically and in a military sense. So, yeah. Thank you.
Thank you. That was very informative. As we know, the NATO alliance has been based around the principle of collective security. And as the United States, Ambassador Sadler, also the United Kingdom has been a very strong player and an important player in NATO. You have the first Secretary General after all. And what is the UK's perspective on NATO, and what is the significance of collective defense for the UK?
Thank you, and I should start by thanking you, Bianco, for hosting us here. This is such a sort of emotive place to do this roundtable, so thank you very much. And thank you for inviting me to speak here alongside such experts in their fields. I am kind of an age where celebrating birthdays is no longer such a great thing, but I am struck that this is a very important moment for NATO, 75 years, and for Slovenia, 20 years. So I do think it's right to take that moment to sort of step back, to celebrate, but also to reflect and think about where we have come from, where we are, and where we're going to in the future. And thank you for your reflections on that, John. It's very useful to have that sort of historical perspective. But to come to your question about this sort of commitment within the UK to NATO, and I am not a military expert like so many others around this, so let me answer this question in my own way. So I think why is NATO so part of the UK's DNA? And I think the first reason is around the importance that we see it gives to our national security. So we as a nation, I suppose, we look back at our history, there's so much history around us, There's a Spitfire simulator, I think we could try here in easy. There is that sense of history and that importance of national security to us. And we see NATO as a core part of that. It represents that safety for us. It represents Petra's point earlier about collectively thinking about peace. It represents peace to us, and that is why I think my first answer to your question would be around national security. And I think my second answer to your question, I say I'm not a military expert, I'm an economist by background. So I think about efficiency, I think about how do you achieve objectives, how do you deliver what you need in the most efficient way. And I think there is a point here about NATO simply being the most efficient answer to the problem of national security. So we in the UK, since 2014 and the Wales Pledge, we have delivered on the 2% target of our spending, of our GDP being on defence spending. We have delivered on that year on year. And our Prime Minister has said that the commitment is there to hit 2.5% when fiscal and other conditions allow. So we are prepared to, if you like, put our money on the table. And that, as I say, is an efficiency point, because if you act together in NATO, then you have this efficiency in terms of tackling threats that pose us all. And I suppose that brings me on to my third answer to your question, which is actually more of a value-based answer. And I was struck by what State Secretary said in his remarks at the beginning about being on the right side of history. And I think there is a point here about NATO representing being on the right side of history. I will keep you cautious of colleagues sitting to my right as well here. I think it is important that we stand together in NATO for our values also, and for being on the right side of history. And on that note, I think it is wonderful that we have done so for 75 years. I am proud as a British person, as a representative of the British government here, to be part of that. And I'm so pleased that NATO has been part of it. Slovenia has been part of NATO for 20 years as well. Looking at the photos outside, we were remarking with the State Secretary on the picture of UK and Slovenian forces working together within a NATO exercise, and that's a wonderful part of our relationship. So thank you.
Let me try with this, if it's going to work. I'll try to be gentle. Thank you, Ambassador. So we have covered the early days of NATO and the guiding principles and the values of NATO. And through the years, as mentioned, NATO has seen many large enlargements, but in the last 25 years, 16 countries joined. This is basically just as much as there have been NATO countries in the first 50 years. So this is a very rapid enlargement. One of these countries, in the fifth and biggest enlargement, was also Slovenia. So Dr. Černičec, I would like to ask you, people have touched upon this already, but why did Slovenia decide to join NATO? There are arguments, we're small, nobody cares about us. Why NATO? And what was the road to NATO like? And where are we now?
Thank you for the question. I will also go a little bit deeper into the history. It's not very well known fact that also Yugoslavia was at some point in history part of the story whether to join NATO. After 1948, when Tito quarrels with Stalin, Yugoslavia went into another direction that was called non-aligned movement. And we were also a recipient of a lot of our predecessors' work, of US help, for example, we saw some of them deriving from the Second World War. And of course, after the Marshall Plan also, and also the jets and different military equipment went into Yugoslavia at that time, because it was a geopolitical game. And of course, Yugoslavia at that time, being in between the West and East, was a very specific playground, and Tito played this game very well. For him and for Yugoslavia, economic indicators from that time were very good. We were living on loans, and a lot of them were not paid off, so it was okay for us. And it's also one very significant exact thing that we have in Slovenia, for example. We have a nuclear power plant in Slovenia that was produced or made up before 1990, so in the old times. And it's not a Russian plant, it's an American plant. Why? It was, of course, political decision at that time that we are going to use Western technology versus the Eastern technology. Slovenes being part of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a Western Central European space, and we are actually also geographically, when you look at the map, we are in the center of Europe. From the Roman times, and also Napoleon knew this very well, the lowest passing to Central Europe goes through Slovenia. Postojna Gate is a very well-known place. It's close to Italian border, and those gates are the closest or the lowest gates to Central Europe. It was very known from military perspective and geopolitical one. And of course, we are in the northern part of the Adriatic Sea. We have the Luka Koper, and also in the modern times, military mobility to Slovenia, to Central Europe, is an important military factor, especially in what is happening now in Europe. We are having a war. I always say, just 500 kilometers away from Slovenia, just across the border, across the Hungary, which is our neighbor, is Ukraine. So basically, it's very close to Slovenia. And we don't have this in Slovenian perception, that it's so close to this war. I said before that we decided in 1990 to have democratic elections. We got a new democratic government, and then a referendum. We want to become independent. We were then next year, after we declared independence, attacked. We fought and we won. Of course, we used this window of historic opportunity with a breakdown of Warsaw Pact of the Soviet Union. So it was a window of opportunity for a small nation as we are, as you mentioned. But nevertheless, we are very specific in because when you look at the map, we have German influence from the north, Romanian, Italian, Romanized Italian from the west, Hungarian from the east, and then we are the most northern part of Yugoslavia. So we were always open to different influences that basically shaped us what we are today. And as I said, we are open democratic society. We had very strong discussions after '93 when we decided that we want to be part of these Euro-Atlantic integrations. And I always said that being NATO member is the cheapest insurance policy. Official numbers from 1989 of Yugoslav army were 4.6% of GDP for defense. That army attacked us. The people who know very well how army was functioning at that time would say it was much more, because military had its own economy, a lot of different dispersed activities that were not part of budget. So it was around 7-8% of GDP. So when we are having these discussions in Slovenia about 2% of GDP for defense, and we never basically came to that number, we are now, of course, in a good trend of rising our defense expenses. We have to remind ourselves how much we were paying for that army that attacked us. Much more, because Slovenes were very big contributors at that time. And of course, also how being non-aligned or independent or country that calls on neutrality, it's a very expensive policy. And at the end of the day, being a neutral doesn't help you. As we see, for example, with Ukraine, and then we have some other also cases in the history, because neutrality is firstly expensive, and secondly, all countries that are at least your neighbors or big powers have to acknowledge this. And if they don't acknowledge you that you are really de facto neutral, then you don't have any benefits out of it. So I went intentionally a little bit into this history to remind us all not just about this 20th anniversary, but actually what was happening before. And therefore I'm saying, I'm very glad to see here, we have Yugoslav equipment, French equipment, Slovenian equipment, Soviet equipment. This is also a symbol, and there, of course, there are also US planes. This is symbolically showing us who we were in the past, and now where we are and where we are going. So we are going to be, as I said, on the right part of history, being a part of core European policies, and I'm very glad that European Union and NATO have the same attitudes towards this war in Europe. As we know, in the past, sometimes we didn't have similar or same views on what is happening around us, I mean in the EU and NATO. Now we are basically on the same page, and this is very optimistic. And I'm sure and I'm convinced that this is going to prevail at the end of the day.
Thank you, Dr. Turcic. And now that we came to the present day, I would like to turn to Ambassador Taran. NATO has voiced very, very strong support for Ukraine's right to self-defense, for the right to choose your own security agreements, and as well an eventual membership into NATO. But please, Ambassador, could you, in your opinion, stemming from your long experience in the defense field, tell to us a bit about what does NATO mean to Ukraine?
Thank you very much for such a good question. First of all, let me congratulate our Slovenian friends with such a date. 20 years being in NATO is really a serious period to be adult member. We are still thinking about it, how to join, how to follow the example of other countries, how to join NATO. And I also would like to say that this is my honor to be among NATO countries here, which are presented today. What does it mean, NATO for Ukraine? It was mentioned several times here that first of all, NATO gives you sense of security. And then NATO gives you sense of peace. And NATO gives you feelings that you are on the right side of the history. Just recently, last week, it was ACES International Conference in Vienna. I was invited as a former Minister of Defense. And it was a round table, there's a discussion. And I told people my feelings about what's going on. I said, look, what we see now, not just in Europe, but in the whole world, how the international security organization failed. All of them. Not just OSCE, but the UN as well. These international organizations, which were created for the security purposes, to avoid future war, they failed. None of them was able to stop war in Ukraine. And it was a British gentleman said, you are wrong. I said, in what sense? He said, not all the international organizations failed. There is NATO. I said, yes. NATO didn't fail in the sense of the NATO organization didn't allow Russia to start war in any country covered by NATO agreement. That's true. That is why actually we consider, well, we need to join NATO to prevent future thinkers, future Russian leaders to think about starting a new war against Ukraine. At the same time, there is two ways road. First, we need NATO, and second, we believe NATO is Ukraine. We, first of all, will strengthen the eastern flank of NATO, and our armed forces are really a good armed forces, experienced armed forces. And as for today, we are the only army which has such a terrible experience of fighting against Russia. Of course, we are doing this with the support from our Western friends, Western allies. But still, our experience, we believe, is very important for NATO as organization and NATO countries, all NATO countries. At the same time, I'd like to mention one more dimension. We believe that we should be invited during the summit in Washington to become a NATO member, to start negotiation, not to become a member immediately after the summit, but to start negotiation. It will show Kremlin's leaders that there is absolutely no sense to continue this war in Ukraine. Ukraine will not be part of Russia. Ukraine is on the way to become part of NATO. It will finalize our way from the former Soviet Union. It will finalize our decision to become an independent country. And it will strengthen the democracy in Europe, strengthen peace in Europe, and strengthen peace in the whole world.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. I have a follow-up question for you. You said the future of Ukraine is NATO and the future of NATO is with Ukraine. But could you please expand a bit more on what your view is on the future of the alliance more generally? Of course, with Ukraine, but your thoughts on the future of the alliance.
Future of the alliance is, in my view, is very simple. NATO already proves that this is the strongest political and military alliance in the world. And it will be even stronger when we join NATO, I believe. It will prevent any attempt from any aggressor all over the world to think about possible aggression toward any country. It will strengthen the security, not just in Europe, but in other countries as well.
Thank you so much. So the future of the alliance is stronger, more secure, Europe and the surrounding area. So now that we move a bit to the future, I have a question for you, Dr. Callahan. We've heard the views of Ambassador Taran, but this topic is not relevant just for the future, but also for the present. It's the way how NATO can communicate its role and significance right now and in the future. So the recent survey of NATO that came out last month, actually a few weeks ago, shows us that NATO enjoys overall strong support within the alliance. Some more than others, but still strong support. In the same survey, the risk of war was seen as the greatest concern by 22% of the survey. And it came in as a fifth factor after economic factors and climate change. So how can NATO effectively communicate its role and significance to the general public and in particular younger generations? Would you like this one or that?
Apparently I'm allergic to that. So the poll you mentioned, some of the things that stand out to me, the NATO piece, but also people who think that war is a threat. And maybe it's there that understanding has to be built. Because if more people would understand that war is once again a major threat, then, okay, well then how do we protect ourselves? Then it would follow that the alliance and how to protect yourself would come, right? So then it's sort of, so how do you do it? How do you do either one? One thing that I've been doing here for the last few days is actually speaking to the student groups in a professorial role, in an academic role, talking about the history of the alliance, what I believe is going on in the world, the threats that I see, and then what the response should be. And this isn't an advertisement for sending me around the world, but the point is that you need to get trustworthy people out there at all levels talking to groups about these issues. Now, one big challenge is it's traditionally the younger generations, and I just turned 51, and now I realize that's not me anymore. But the 20-somethings, the 30-somethings, who are generations removed, even from the events over here, even from the 1990s, not to mention multiple generations removed from the Second World War and the understood threats of the Cold War. So, and that's not just here, it's globally. Current generations are primarily interested in where they're going to get a job after college and what inflation is doing to the global economy, because then they can't get jobs, and how they pay for their lives. And it's very understandable because of NATO, we have had decades and decades of peace. And when there's peace, you spend money on the things that are peaceful. You know, and it's a shock. You read about, even in 1914, a war that pretty much everybody wanted. And you read about what was happening in the UK with the lights going out around Europe. And even though the war was happening, the World War had begun, and people were still clung to peace, and for as long as they could, in those regions where they weren't directly attacked or directly, bombed. And so this is, you can tell I don't have a really good answer, but it's a difficult thing. And some of the things that I've said in the past few days, somebody yesterday said, should we be afraid? It's like, no, I'm not afraid. Fear is the worst thing, because irrational decisions come from fear. But concern, understand, expose people to information that is truthful and will help them understand what's going on in the world and get them outside of, I want to make hand gestures, I'm sorry, and get them outside of their social media induced stovepipes of self-affirmation and create trust, which also helps combat disinformation. All of these things have to be done by all of our member states all the time, every day. It has to. We have to put the persistent effort into informing all of our people that the Russians and others put into disinforming them, and we don't. And we need to cross the border. So it's not a super awesome answer, but it's events like this. It's getting this event into the news and talking about it and getting out there and at the grassroots level. Because if you want to treat it like a political issue, politics is grassroots. And at the lowest levels, these issues must be talked about. And then it'll come up to the high levels. So I hope that's going forward. I said hope twice. That's good, right? So thank you.
We are hopeful, yes, but thank you for your answer, because it leads nicely into my next question, because you said, we did record the answer. You said that efforts need to be made by everyone, and I would argue that they need to be made by every sector of society. It shouldn't fall just to the ministries of defense, but it should fall to the whole of society to communicate this trust and these informations. So this kind of leads into my next question for Ambassador Stadler, and it ties to what our Prime Minister, Robert said last week when he visited NATO HQ and met with the Secretary General. One of his messages was the importance of unity. So lately we have been hearing some worrisome rhetoric by politicians who call into question NATO, but also Sweden's road to NATO has been paved by national interests that trumped the strong united alliance. So in your opinion, how can NATO stay united in the present day, and also how can we maintain this unity in the future?
Thank you for your question. Before I respond to that, I wonder if I could just come back on Andrew's point. Andrew started his intervention by saying that he was honoured to be sitting with 3 representatives of NATO. I think we are honoured to be sitting with you, Andrew. And we should not forget the role that the Ukrainian armed forces are playing in defending the whole of Europe as well. So let me please put that on the table. So you asked about unity across NATO, and I think there are a number of different ways to answer this question. But I think my first point would be to talk about the importance of political leadership. And here I think it is incumbent on all political leaders to think about how they unite their societies and how they get across these messages about NATO working together. And I was struck by John's comment about different generations here. And I think we have to have targeted messages at different groups of our population. I was very struck by State Secretary's comment about insurance policy. I think that those sorts of messages are absolutely key. But I also want to come back on the point about disinformation. I think it is quite easy for us to put out warm, friendly, positive messages, to think about different audiences. We have to be conscious also of those who are seeking to undermine that unity through disinformation activities. I'm continually struck by the amount of disinformation that is out there, the very clever messaging there is around lots of topics, around continually the way that negative actors, state threats, are seeking to undermine us. I see it here a little in Slovenia. I see it, frankly, much more in many other countries. So I think, coming back to your point about unity, there's a point about working across government with all different actors in government, about thinking about different audiences and coming back to really challenge these disinformation narratives, because we cannot be complacent. Those narratives are out there and we need to respond to those quickly, we need to respond to them in a smart way and in a strategic way, so that we're building trust and leveraging that trust to get our messages across.
Thank you so much. So we opened another discussion on disinformation and cross-generational communication, basically. So with that, I would like to ask Dr. Chernetets for his comments on the very specific points of the future of NATO. One of the guiding principles of NATO is its open door policy. So basically, we are expecting next generations to also be members of NATO, to be our allies. Do you think there is a future for the open door policy? And in your opinion, is there an end to it?
Yeah, very good question. When I was listening to my predecessors, I was thinking about year 2015 and 16, when I was in Montenegro, advisor to the Minister of Defense at that time, before the Montenegro got the invitation for being a member of NATO. And I was part of the public diplomacy, of course, campaigning for NATO. And one of the questions, and we know a very specific situation Montenegro is in, demographically, historically, and everything. There was also one case when, in 1990, when fighters flew over Belgrade, and then they were returning. They dropped some bombs in one of the bridges in northern part of Montenegro, and some civilians were killed. And this is a very symbolic, motivating factor for the camp who was against the NATO, and still is, to do the campaign. And I was asked the question, why we should go in NATO? What it is in NATO for us? Very concretely, exactly what I'm going to get as a citizen of the country from NATO. And I said, you are not going to get anything, you know. Nobody is going to give you 100 euros on your bank account or in the end, no. But what you are getting is, you're getting, and therefore I mentioned insurance policy, you're getting the fact that your country is going to be part of the alliance, that is going to, by being part of it, itself is going to be a security and economic provider for prosperity of your country. So what are you getting out of it? That your country is going to be more open for investments, that investors will come and you will get jobs, you will get better jobs with added value, you will have a new think tanks, you will have a new research centers, facility, more tourists will come, so you are going to get a better, higher amount for leasing your apartments in summertime, so very exact things. So you are getting to be perceived as a safe and secure country. And this is the basic foundation for everything else. And then, of course, we tend to forget this. And in case of Ukraine, we are all reminded of that basically the security is a precondition of everything. So if you don't have a secure environment, then it's, of course, personal security, then it's a societal security or country security, but at the end of the day, when your kids cannot go to school, then you understand things. And this is the point. And it's very simplistically, you can explain it. Now coming directly to the question you ask, therefore I mentioned that this organization is very propulsive. Why? When I was a student in 1990s, early 1990s, we were discussing about neutral states. Finland, Sweden, Switzerland, Austria. And I never thought that I'm going to see Sweden and Finland become a NATO member. This is really so much against everything. And they decided like this, and they become members like this. It's just a big and huge consequence of this war. Therefore, geopolitically, geostrategically, of course, Putin lost this war. The biggest victims, of course, are the Ukrainians who are dying in the fronts, civilians in the cities. But he didn't succeed in his intention, and he will not succeed. Therefore, of course, the open door policy is here. It's going to remain. And as you know, Slovenia, as a NATO member, was very deeply involved into providing, being a security provider. We provided much more forces on the ground through the NATO missions than the majority of the countries, focusing on not Afghanistan, which was much more debated, but in Western Balkans, for example. In Bosnia, less, much more in Kosovo. And we still hear today or see, and also it was mentioned today already, our Prime Minister, who said we are going to increase our presence in Kosovo, because after 99, still the situation in the region, and this is also then our national security in terms of Slovenia, that the region is stable. It's not as good as we would like it to be. And what is the solution? And of course, this first phase, yes, to provide for secure environment, and this phase 2, to bring in European Union and in NATO all the ones that they want to be there. And this is a very simple. Therefore, we as a country, and I personally, we are supporting the, of course, open door policy, not just for NATO, but as you know, Slovenia was a very strong advocate also for Bosnia and Herzegovina to start the negotiation process. And it just happened also by very strong pushes from our government, because we sincerely believe into this.
Thank you so much. So this was my last question for the panelists. So I'm glad we closed it out on a positive note that there is a future for NATO, there is a future for a stronger NATO, but we have to be a bit cautious about how we fight this information and how we communicate these things. I would like to thank you for your participation in this panel, but we have still some time left, so if there's anyone from the audience who has a question, please feel free.
Or comment.
When you move out, I have a good voice. Hello, Simon from Požar. I have two questions. First of all, Poland, the Czech Republic, and Hungary celebrate 25 years of NATO. So our president, when he visited the White House, say about the 3% of the GDP of spending to army. So what do you think? Of course, this is something that we can discuss because now half of NATO doesn't spend such a 2%. So what do you think in perspective of 15 years, is it possible to put such a gap, 3% of GDP to spending on the army? And the second question I have for Mr. Kurent, what about the spending of money to military equipment, especially the carriers of your army? What about the proceeding and what is the final decision about that? Thank you very much.
3%. That's it. Yeah.
Okay, so thank you for the question and thank you for sort of bringing it out in the open, because I think it's an issue where there are differences and it's good to discuss them. So my government's position is to say that we have hit 2% since all NATO allies have committed to it in Wales. We have said that we will hit 2.5% when fiscal and other conditions permit. I should say that I don't think anyone wants to spend money on defence for the sake of it. I was at a different panel recently where someone said we should be making love, not war. We should be spending money on healthcare. We should not be spending money on weapons and defence. But there is a reason we need to spend money on defence. There is a reason that we need to keep ourselves safe. So I would hope that we don't need to keep spending more and more and more and more, because I would hope that we can collectively, as an alliance, tackle the threats that are out there. But I do think that all allies should live up to their commitments of hitting 2%, and I think it is a perfectly valid conversation to have. Does that sort of answer your question?
Good. This is some kind of discussion about all the NATO members in the near future.
It's a conversation. I mean, there is a point about efficiency as well, and about spending money in the right way and on the correct things. I think State Secretary's point about Slovenia's participation in so many international operations is really key. We in the UK also have contributed to, I think, and I'm turning to the historian here, but I think the UK has contributed to every NATO operation, and we're pretty proud of that. I guess in some cases it might have been a relatively small contribution, but it's still a nice thing to be able to say. So there's a point also there about contributions more widely, which I think is worth bringing out. That would be my position. State Secretary.
Thank you. Yes, when we published a few months ago on our internet page the numbers of spending of Slovenia for defense since 1991. You can see them there. It was a lot of effort to bring this all together because of the old currency that we have, and it was not on the same space or in one place, but now it's on the internet and everyone can see it. So being transparent what we were doing in the past. As I said, we conquered the army with, I would say, bare hands, but we were forced, because we were under embargo at that time, in 91, to smuggle weaponry to stop this strong army. So we know very well about how to secure your country in the time of war. We learned our lesson, we understand that we are part of, as I said before, now of system of collective defense, and the pillar for that is also individual defense. That the burden sharing is a criteria. It's not only about the numbers of the percentage of GDP, it's the question also of the quality and personal engagement, as I said. Therefore, we were always hitting very strongly with our operations abroad. While the process of modernization of the Slovenian armed forces stalled. This is the reality. We were even below 1% 10 years ago, 12 years ago. So we are now on the very good track of being in the process of modernization. As you can hear or read it in Slovenian media, because we communicate this constantly, what we are purchasing, where are the processes. We already bought some of the equipments. Other processes are ongoing. They are going to be concluded, some of them maybe this year, next year. We'll see. And what is important that we have in this term of this government, we put together a paper which is called Resolution on the Long-Term Plan of Development of Slovenian Armed Forces, which was then followed up by the midterm plan, where we directly provided a table or a scheme with the numbers how we are going to increase our defense expenses to 2%. And I'm confident that we are going to go in this direction in the years to come. And you know, when they ask me about this 2% or 3% even discussions, we have to be also, once again, realistic about it. We discussed this in the previous discussions. The threat perception is also a driving force. And the threat perception in Slovenia is totally different than, of course, the eastern part of the alliance. I understand this. And the perception of the imminent threat is totally different. But still, we, as I said, being part of this collective defense, we understand, we are listening, we are hearing, and we are doing this not for NATO, we are doing this for ourselves. Because we want to have strong military, and the military that this country needs for itself, for its purposes. And as you know, we have a professional military, but still nowadays we have a very strong discussions about how to recruit more people into the military. Because until 2003, so it's also 21st anniversary, we abolished the conscript system that we have for 200 years. And now we are not going to, of course, introduce the conscript system, not immediately. We are discussing about how to provide more people for Slovenian armed forces. Because we are economically good, we have 3% unemployment rate, and it's not easy to get people in the military. Because, as again, the threat perception is not here. And this is not just a Slovenian challenge, as you know. A lot of modern Central European, NATO member European Union states have a similar problem. Things are changing, and now competing whether to have 2, 3, or whatever, 4%. I'm very realistic about it. So we are going to be as we are in Slovenia, no doubt about it. So on the track to 2%, nominally increasing our expenditures, but not for everything. In the old times, we also bought some used equipment from some member states, And we are not going to make some similar mistakes as we done in the past. So we are going to be very smart about it.
Thank you so much. I hope that answers your questions. Any other questions or comments? Then I would like to thank you all for attending this panel discussion. Thank you again to our panelists, and I would like to invite you for the reception, and you can